Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for the International Relations Council's Global Experience Series. Tonight, we present a visitor's perspective on Cuba in transition with our guest, Ben Martin. Cuba sits a mere 90 miles off the US coast, but few from the mainland have had the opportunity to immerse themselves in the nuances of Cuba's history, culture, and relationship with the United States. Tonight, Ben Martin, board member of the International Relations Council's organizational member, the English-speaking Union, the Kansas City branch, will reflect on observations and lessons he gleaned from his 2016 visit to this Caribbean nation in transition. My name is Evan Verplew, and I am the program manager for the International Relations Council. The IRC strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. We are proud to be partnering in tonight's Global Experience event with the Kansas City branch of the English-speaking Union. The English-speaking Union is a nonprofit educational and membership organization with branches in over 60 countries worldwide. The US headquarters was founded in 1920 in New York City with more than 4,000 members in 65 branches throughout the United States. The Kansas City branch of the ESU was also founded in 1920 and just celebrated its 100th anniversary last year. The ESU focuses its educational activities on youth speaking programs, teacher enrichment and support, new immigrant support and cultural exchange, lecture programs, and scholarships. Tonight, we invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions or make any comments that you have about the program. This program will be recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube page, the IRC's YouTube page tomorrow. So without further ado, I would like to pass things over to Ben. Ben Martin taught and directed speech and theater in Missouri high schools for 34 years before retiring in the spring of 2010 from the Lee Summit School District. He served many years on the boards of Speech and Theater Association of Missouri, the Missouri State Thespians, and the National Board of the Educational Theater Association. Ben is an active advocate for arts education programs and served as the executive director for the Missouri Alliance for Arts Education until he re-retired in July 2020. He continues as the State Advocacy Captain for the Americans for the Arts. Ben and his wife Roxanne have been involved in the English-speaking Union ever since 1998, where he was honored to receive an ESU scholarship to study at the International Globe Center in London. They are committed to the idea that travel broadens the mind and allows one to become a more discerning and educated citizen. They've led student tours over a dozen times to London, Dublin, New York, and Paris. Among their many additional adventures have been trips to Central Europe, the Mediterranean, the Panama Canal, almost all 50 states, 23 national parks, and Alaska, both in summer and winter. They have ridden on a dog sled, sat in an hour traffic jam in the Mojave Desert with no air conditioning, survived an emergency landing at KCI, visited 5 different volcanoes, and sailed through a tropical storm on the Queen Mary 2. And of course, one of their favorite adventures was the location in today's talk, Cuba. Ben does not claim to be an expert on all things Cuban, but his experience there was a unique and eye-opening time. He hopes that in the very near future, you might also be able to enjoy a trip to our closest but most difficult to reach neighbor. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Ben. Please take it away.
Hola, buenas noches. And now that you've heard the full range of my Spanish language, we will go ahead and get started here with our trip. As Evan said, make sure if you have any questions or comments that you would like to make, feel free to put them in that chat or Q&A section on the page. Thank you, Evan, very much for that introduction. And my thanks to both the IRC and the ESU for being sponsors for tonight's presentation. I'm going to share my screen and just want to make sure that I am indeed being seen here. So there we go. Okay, so This is our title page, and there is the ship that we actually sailed on, which is the Adonia, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go
Sorry,
along.
Ben, just to interrupt quickly. It looks like we're seeing maybe your presenter view. We can see the next slide also on the page. I figure you may want to address that before we get going too much longer.
Okay. Let's see here. There we are. I will share a different screen. How's that work?
Perfect. Thanks, Ben.
Very good. Okay. All right. So, and as has already been mentioned, putting the questions or comments there is great. And that's a nighttime view. The first view was our ship in Santiago de Cuba, and this one is actually in Cienfuegos, a little bit different town in Cuba. So let's go ahead and get started right away here with some of our experiences. I'll be doing some talk about the history, some talk about our cruise, combining both along the way here too. I'm also going to change my glasses so I can actually see the screen in front of me and see what is actually up there for me to talk about. So, how did I get started in this whole thing? How did we make this thing happen in the first place? Well, in November of 2016, we realized that this was going to be our first Christmas without either of our daughters being home. They were both going to see their in-laws for the Christmas season. So I contacted a travel agent friend and said, "Hey, what do empty nesters around the Midwest usually do? Do you have any ideas?" And she said, the quote right there, "Well, I'm going to go to Cuba. Will you want to come with us?" Well, we hadn't really considered that possibility before. I'd been interested in Cuba, but we talked it over and the price looked right. So we went ahead and added the trip into our itinerary. So we went. Now, Fathom Cruise Line is who we cruised with. It was a division of Princess, and it made history actually when the Adonia docked in Havana on May 2nd of 2016, and that's the first cruise ship from America, from the United States, that had reached Cuba or been allowed to dock in Cuba for probably over 50 years. Fathom was discontinued in 2017. Other American cruise ships were able to go until 2019 when the Trump administration banned those trips. And there is the ship sitting at dock as well. So anyway, on December 25th, we boarded the ship. Before we knew it, we were on board, and we had a lot of very interesting people along with us who were sharing our trip. And so we were able to entertain and celebrate Christmas on board a ship just outside of Miami. It was kind of an interesting experience. As part of our people study visa, which is how we were allowed to travel to Cuba at the time, we had to agree to take classes on board to learn about the people. So we were very committed to that task. We obviously enjoyed music on board ship, not always Cuban music necessarily. Oh yeah, we relaxed on the deck. I had some great food sitting outside on the deck, and then we always had, you know, a refreshing beverage. So obviously we're very committed to learning as much as we could on the trip. And I'm being lighthearted here, but we actually did take a number of classes to fulfill our people-to-people study visa. Learned quite a bit about the people and the culture, and especially learned about what was acceptable behavior and what was not acceptable behavior. And I'll talk about some of that as we go along here as well too. So anyhow, let me give you a brief history of Cuba to catch you up. Cuba is not a place necessarily that is featured in our history classes in schools. So I wanted to make sure that we're clear on that. 1492, Columbus lands on the north coast of Cuba. He doesn't tell the people back home in Spain, though, that he did take a ride in a 1952 Ford Custom Line convertible. Again, you're going to have to get used to my sense of humor, I'm afraid. So Cuba quite quickly becomes a center of Spanish culture within the Americas. Santiago especially becomes an area where a lot of settlement is. This actually is a home that is in the central part of Santiago de Cuba. It is the oldest surviving colonial home. in the Americas. It was built in 1522. It has been updated, obviously, since then, but that was an interesting place to visit and study as well. Cuba quickly settled in as sort of the breadbasket for Spanish America. It didn't have the big silver deposit, gold deposits that the Spanish were after in other places, but it did have the ability to be an agricultural resource. As years went on, native-born Creoles, who were Spanish extraction but born in Cuba, became the dominant members of the economy, the dominant members of the society, but began to resent the Spanish rule, which in many ways was kind of reflective of the British rule of the American colonies in the United States, what's now the United States. There just wasn't a sense of their representation being accepted. So over the years, Spanish possessions slipped away from Spain's grip, especially in the early part of the 19th century. You can see here the list of the countries that became independent from Spain over those years. And by 1850, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained in Spanish hands. So that takes us to the lead up to the Spanish-American War. Economic troubles besieged Cuba during the mid-1800s. There's a commission that the Spanish appoint to try to work on some reforms to make things better. They come up with some ideas that might have actually worked, but a conservative government is elected or chosen or comes to power within Spain and rejects all of those reforms, institutes more taxes and fees, refusing to give Cubans any kind of representation in the Spanish government. And that sounds very familiar to what happened a little bit further north about a century before. So the lead up then begins a series of revolts that take place against the Spanish rule. The most severe and most effective one of them comes on October 10th, 1868. It's the Cry of Yara. Carlos Cespedes, who is a Creole landlord and landowner, frees his slaves and declares Cuba free of Spanish rule. And that brings about what was called the 10 Years' War. In this war, over 200,000 people died. It was a vicious and terrible struggle. And after 10 years, in 1878, a peace treaty was signed. There were some limited concessions made by the Spanish government, but everybody knew that it was probably not enough. And so there's quite a bit of tension that continued within the culture during that time. Tensions finally explode in the 1890s. A group of Cuban exiles invade Cuba from South Florida. And what does that remind us of? Landing in 1895. They are led by Jose Marti, who is really, in many ways today, still the national hero for the Cubans. He dies very soon in a battle in 1895, but his memory is still revered today. The two pictures toward the bottom of the slide, one of them on the left, I think, is in Havana. The other one on the right is in Cienfuegos. So here's a trivia question for you. All right, so the U.S. owns a lease to Guantanamo on Cuban soil. Cuba actually owns land in the United States. Do you know where? And I'm going to go ahead and reveal the answer here. If you have guessed already, congratulations. This is the land itself, and it is known as Parque Amigos de Jose Marti. In other words, Jose Marti Park. It is in Tampa, Florida. It's a 0.14 of an acre. It's actually legally owned by Cuba since 1956, which was before Castro came to power. A wealthy Cuban immigrant to the United States ceded it to the Cuban government. And it's actually the only tract of land within the United States that's actually owned by a foreign government. Now, before you get too concerned that the Cuban communist government is profiting off of this, although the land is owned by the Cuban government, it is managed by a virulently anti-Castro group that is based in Miami, Florida. And so the the Cuban government kind of owns it, but has no hand whatsoever in managing this particular little park. As we get closer to the actual beginning of the Spanish-American War, powerful interests in the U.S. drum up all kinds of support for the Cuban insurrectionists and trying to get Americans to intervene. This goes back to the old yellow journalism that we did learn about in school. I kind of call this the original fake news because it influences public opinion with all kinds of exaggerated stories of Spanish atrocities and Cuban heroism. You can see some of the imagery that was used within the newspapers at that particular time. And of course, then this incident occurs. I think you probably recognize that this is the battleship Maine, the US American battleship, the Maine. It blows up in Havana's harbor in the spring of 1898. Various theories about how and why it blew up have been advanced. At the time, they expected or they suspected that the Spanish government had done it. Some people said, well, Cuban revolutionaries did it in order to involve the Americans. And many people also said there was just an accident on board that exploded the Maine. We really I don't think we've ever really determined the exact cause of that. But at any rate, it did happen. So Hearst and Remington was his reporter in Cuba. Hearst, of course, was the newspaper magnate and famously said to Remington, hey, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. And so with the Maine especially, that set in motion an inevitable series of events. Oddly enough, McKinley, Speaker of the House Reed, and almost all of the business community were opposed to the war, but the newspapers' constant hammering of the idea of we need to go to war, we need to free the Cubans, eventually led to a declaration of war on April 21st, 1898. American forces were actually almost already in place, just off the coast, ready to invade. And so the war got underway very, very quickly after that. So one of the most famous events within that war, of course, is Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders charge. What hill did they charge up during the Spanish-American War? And again, think about that for a moment. And you may have the idea that you know the answer, but you may not as well. The answer is Kettle Hill, which is just to the northeast of San Juan Hill. He was ordered to take that position by General Schaefer. And when he did get up to the top of the hill, he saw that the charge up San Juan Hill was floundering and then joined the advance on that position. So his troops came rushing down Kettle Hill and then started up San Juan Hill. Another little bit of trivia here too. His forces were joined by black soldiers from the 10th Cavalry Unit, which is better known as the Buffalo Soldiers, who are memorialized up at Fort Leavenworth now. So a lot of people don't realize that this was actually one of the first mixed combats that actually occurred, not necessarily by design, but just simply because they picked people up along the way and they joined the charge. So here's a map of the war as at least in southern Cuba. By the way, the name up there at the top, the Cubans definitely reminded us every time that we talked about the Spanish-American War that it was not the Spanish-American War, it was the Spanish-Cuban-American War. This was after all, their war of independence. And so it has that name on the island of Cuba now. We forget that middle party in there, or that actually very important party in there. But it is definitely a part of the war. There were Cuban forces involved all throughout the battles. You can see here how the war proceeded in terms of that particular part of Cuba, Santiago, with July 1 being the day that the big battle in San Juan Hill was fought. So it does help to have a good publicist if you are charging up a hill and wanting to become a war hero. So up in the upper left is the idealized version of Colonel Roosevelt leading his troops up the hill. To the right, lower right, is a much more realistic version of what actually was going on, how the battle was actually being fought. with the barricades and the tower, the watchtower, up there in the hill, on the hill. And this is the way that San Juan Hill looks today. So the watchtower still is there, surrounded by a number of artillery pieces that were used within the battle. It is a fairly sizable hill that overlooks Santiago de Cuba. On the backside of it is a little amusement park. There's a Ferris wheel there. There's actually a school down there as well. On the lower right, you can see the cannon pointed toward the distance, and in the distance, you can barely see some buildings in Santiago. So you get a good sense of how strategic San Juan Hill was in terms of that battle, because the Americans could command the territory, the terrain, after they took that hill. Cubans have maintained the memorials that are there. And in fact, actually, there's quite a few memorials to the American troops who fought. These two plaques commemorate the men who died during the battle. Oddly enough, the temperature that day was well over 100 degrees. And so many of the people who perished that day perished from heat exhaustion as much as they did from enemy bullets. And the statue is the statue in honor of the American troops who fought. And this plaque that was erected in 1928 memorializes that. And it has, again, been maintained by the current Cuban government as well, or current Cuban peoples who were there as well. Well, after the Spanish-American or Spanish-Cuban-American War was completed, Cuba regained its freedom. A series of governments came into power. Some representatives, some authoritarians, some dictatorships. This was the final dictator who ruled in Cuba. His name was Fulgencio Batista. And although he was nominally in charge, when it came to especially the area around Havana, there was somebody else who was far more powerful and far more in charge. And that was Meyer Lansky and his friends with the mob, or the mafia. They were based in the Riviera Hotel, which was in downtown Havana. This is the Riviera. It still exists today, and is, I think, used as apartments. I don't believe it's a hotel anymore. But the Riviera is there, and so there were lots of difficulties, lots of problems with the fact that the Cubans weren't really ruling Cuba. American gangsters were ruling Cuba. And that, among other things, led to a new Cuban revolution, which began in July of 1953. And it succeeded in ousting Batista on December 31st of 1958. Led by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and others. It actually began in the mountains just north of Santiago de Cuba, where almost all of the different revolutions that have happened in Cuba began. And so it was successful in December of 1958. At first, we were on kind of friendly relationships with Castro and his Cuban government. Castro actually visits Washington, D.C. There's a picture of him at the Lincoln Memorial, and a picture of him shaking hands with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon doesn't look particularly pleased about this, but overall there was not the same kind of anger and antipathy that currently exist between the Cubans and the Americans at that time, or the U.S. at that time. Then, however, Castro went to the United Nations and gave what was called the Yankee imperialism speech, decrying U.S. interference in Cuban affairs and affairs throughout Latin America. Eisenhower responds in October of 1960 with a trade embargo, and then finally in January of 1961, we sever diplomatic relationships with Cuba altogether. In April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion happens. Unlike Martí's invasion and the subsequent fighting that went on in the late 1890s, this was a complete disaster. And the invaders, the Cuban exiles who invaded, were roundly defeated and quickly defeated, actually. October of 1962, probably the lowest point of relations between Cuba and the United States was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia, or Soviet Union, and the United States faced off, came very, very close to a nuclear war at that particular time. I still remember the drills in elementary school where we were taught to duck and cover and go under our desks. So that was a very scary time in our nation's history, in our two nations' histories. However, things thawed a little bit in 1977 when President Carter opened an interest section, a U.S. interest section in the Swiss embassy. So we had some kind of representation in Cuba after that. And then in December of 2014, President Obama announced major shifts in the Cuban policy for the United States. In August of 2015, he reopened the U.S. embassy. And this is a picture of the embassy that we took actually on our ride in the convertible 1952 Custom Line. It's a pretty imposing building there. Spring of 2016, baseball diplomacy takes effect here. So there's a picture of Barack Obama and Raul Castro enjoying a baseball game in Havana. I believe it was the Atlanta Braves and the Cuban national team that played. I'm not certain on that, but I think that's what it was. And so it looked like for a while there that Cuba and the United States were going to have far better relationships. However, in November of 2016, President Trump won the election partly because he had huge support from the Cuban exile community in South Florida. And so he reimposed sanctions, in fact, strengthened the sanctions. And you can read all the things that were done there, but there's a whole list of things that were put in place in order to punish the Cubans, especially punish the Cuban military, and reward those who voted for him in South Florida. So what's the future policy toward Cuba under the Biden administration? Well, President Biden campaigned on the idea of re-engaging with Cuban government, and everybody assumed that was going to be opening things up again, much like things had been under the Obama administration. However, there have been a number of different complicating factors. The Havana syndrome, which was U.S. diplomats reporting all kinds of strange symptoms, headaches, nausea, so on and so forth, when they were in the embassy in Havana, and people suggested that might be a microwave weapon of some sort that was being aimed that way. Obviously, there have been over the last year or so a number of demonstrations on the island of people protesting against the current government, especially against the economic policies of the government. COVID-19 has not made anything any better in Cuba. And so some of those demonstrations were put down rather violently. And so that has created problems for the Biden administration as far as opening up. And of course, the Cuban exile community in South Florida has also created difficulties too, because the Democratic Party would love to win Florida, but it's going to be very difficult to win Florida if they antagonize the Cuban exile community. So this article in Reuters from November 5th of this year is just a pretty good explanation of exactly what the political considerations are right now for the Biden administration. Giving you a moment to read that rather than me just reading it out loud. So let's talk about you perhaps actually being able to go to Cuba yourself and discover these things that I'm talking about with your own eyes. Even with all the current sanctions and everything that is in place, you can still go to Cuba. The biggest problems are qualifying for the properly approved travel visas and travel categories that you want to go in. Now, as far as COVID is concerned in Cuba, just recently, November 15th, for example, they have relaxed a number of the restrictions on being able to shop or enter the airports or anything like that. Cuba has registered over 960,000 cases of COVID, And so it has been a severe impact on that island nation. But there are ways still to get to Cuba and go. So here are the 12 approved categories for traveling to the Cuban government, Cuban island. And these are put in place by the U.S. State Department. So you can go for family visits, official government business, journalistic activity, and so on down the line until you get to finally certain export transactions. So business is definitely a reason why you are allowed to go into Cuba. However, missing from the list is the way that we went, because that was deleted from the list of approved categories during the Trump administration, and that was people-to-people travel. In this particular category, what you were able to do is claim that you were going to interact and meet with the people of Cuba and show them, what wonderful people Americans are and discover what wonderful people Cubans are. It was essentially you're going as a tourist, an informed tourist, and one who had to perform certain things, but you were able to go on sort of a tourism visa. So if you are going to go, even though you can't go as a tourist anymore, here are the things that you do have to do. First of all, you've got to secure a visa from the Cuban government. There's the form. You have to fill out the necessary State Department affidavit stating the reason for your visit. I've included the first opening paragraph. That opening paragraph is followed by about 25 pages of verbiage on the various ways of you being able to visit and what the requirements are. You initial a lot, you sign a lot, and you say you'll abide by all the different rules that are there. And then finally, you have to record your activities in a journal that the State Department requires you to keep for a 5-year period. So that's the first page of ours. I added pictures, and so I'm definitely going to keep it because we just had a good time compiling the journal. However, on January 1st of 2022, I will be past my required time, and I could, if I wanted to, then destroy that journal. I would not have to have it. The State Department has never asked me for anything as far as the journal was concerned. They've never asked to see it or note that I have it or anything like that. It's just one of the requirements that you have. If you're going, you want to figure out exactly how you're going to get there. Currently, JetBlue is the only U.S. airline that I was able to find that has a regularly scheduled flight from the United States to Havana. There are some other airlines that land in the United States that will pick you up and take you to a third country and then take you to Cuba. But JetBlue is the only one that has direct ones that I was able to discover right now. Southwest and American used to, but they discontinued theirs and they have not put them back in yet, as far as I can tell. You can also do just regular travel through a third country, catch a ship or whatever it might be, but there might be some problems with you running afoul of U.S. regulations if you do that, so approach that with caution. Currently, there are no cruises that originate in the United States that then will call in Havana or any of the other cities of Cuba. So some other tips for visiting Cuba. While you're there, first of all, go beyond Havana. I can't stress that enough. Going to Havana and saying you've been to Cuba is like going to New York and saying you've been to the United States. It's a big city. It has its wonderful things about it, but there are so many other parts of Cuba and so many other places and cultures within the island nation that you ought to visit too. It is a big, big country when you think about it. It's hundreds of miles long. The island is hundreds of miles long with very distinct regions. So Santiago de Cuba was our first landing place when we arrived there. You can note the things about it there, the Spanish-American war sites. It's a working class town. It suffers, I think, from poverty more than any other big city in Cuba. It's also the heart of the Afro-Cuban culture. And if that is something that fascinates you, please go and visit it and take part in it. The artwork, the music, the faith that is expressed there is really interesting. It is, as you can see by those two pictures near the bottom, people don't live a very high standard of living. They all have homes. That's one thing the Cuban government promises them, but the homes are modest, to say the least. In Cienfuegos, this is also on the south coast of Cuba, the Pearl of the South. It was a resort town where people who were of wealth were able to go and enjoy themselves during the 1800s and 1900s. It is still got a lot of that sense about it, even though it's a communist government and a communist society where no one's supposed to be above another person. But it is fading a little bit too. This center picture here of the arcade, I don't know if you can see it exactly, but a lot of the tiles are missing there. So it has seen better days. And of course, the area here, the rooftops are just sort of scattered with all kinds of makeshift things. Antennas, water heaters in blue plastic jugs. All of these are things that you will see there in Cienfuegos and throughout Cuba, where there's a lot of makeshift that happens with the people trying to do the best they can. I think also one thing I would say is look for the two Cubas, because there really are two Cubas today. There's the Cuba that is trying to reach out and reach forward and engage with the world, experimenting with free enterprise and doing things like that. And then there's the communist Cuba that's still stuck with the government and in the philosophies of the past. You'll see a number of examples of these kind of things throughout, especially in Havana, but elsewhere too. So for example, these two Havana piers, the one that is on the left is beautifully restored and working and active. The cruise ship that's by it, by the way, is a small European cruise ship. The Europeans have visited Cuba throughout the embargo. But just 100 feet away, you can see it sort of in this picture, but on the right-hand side, 100 feet away is a completely derelict pier that nobody uses and has never been restored and doesn't look like it's going to be restored in the near future at all. Also, classic structures, the beautiful structures. This is at the top a picture of the Opera House in downtown Havana. It is a wonderful structure, beautiful, beautiful old theater. And just across the street from it is the capital of Cuba. Note that it's probably modeled after something that you recognize. It is modeled after the capital in Washington, D.C. Cubans were quick to point out, however, that their capital stands 1 meter taller than the capital in Washington, D.C. They just had to try to get that up on us. But immediately across the street from the Capitol and just behind the Opera House is this building. It's an old theater. You could see that the roof is collapsed. You could see a tree growing out from inside the building. And this is literally a derelict building that sits and has sat for a long time just across the street from their national capital, just behind their showpiece of a theater for their performing arts. And it is the two Cubas. It's this sense of some places are favored and restored and others are neglected completely. You have the beautiful sites, for example, this Board of Trade building in downtown Havana, and then frightening sites like this electrical pole in Cienfuegos. I don't know if any of you are electricians, but I think you probably recognize the idea that this is not the way to go about wiring up the electrical grid for your city. The thing that was most frightening to me was I could reach out from the spot where I was on this particular building and touch it if I wanted to. It was literally about 2.5, 3 feet away. And if I had done so, I would not be here talking to you tonight. So it's something to keep in mind too, that there's just this sense of repair and disrepair throughout the community. Another thing is the food and the restaurants and service and so on. La Mina was this wonderful little cafe that we found one day when we were wandering around Havana. It is a state-run cafe, and so we looked at the menu, and the server came over and said, "Oh, here's your menu, and we recommend that you get the special." And I wasn't that thrilled with the special, so I said, "Well, what about this on the menu?" She said, "Oh, we're out of that. Go ahead and get the special." And so I looked at something else on the menu and said, "What about this?" And she said, "We're out of that. I think you ought to get the special." It became pretty quickly apparent that I needed to get the special because nothing else was there. And the special was good, but everybody else was having the special too. That was what they had. It was a state-run restaurant. Meanwhile, Bonita is a La Paladar. And Paladars are private homes that have been converted into restaurants. It's a free enterprise kind of system. These are privately owned restaurants. When we were there, we had our choice of lobster or steak with all the fixings. It was some of the best lobster I think I've ever had in my life. And it was really a wonderful experience. And again, that's that new Cuba that is trying to emerge, where people are really trying to embrace a free enterprise and capitalist system. Also, you get this sense, this kind of divided sense among the people themselves and their attitudes toward the United States. Number one, they love Americans. Here's a statue of Ernest Hemingway in La Floridita restaurant. But they love their revolution also. Fidel Castro's memorial in Park Cespedes in Santiago. An entire acre of this park is just covered with the pictures of Castro and various heroes of the revolution. And people are there watching it, looking at it, enjoying it, but they're also there enjoying Ernest Hemingway. In fact, actually, quick trivia here. Why is Ernest Hemingway's statue at this bar? Because the bar inside La Floridita is where Hemingway reportedly invented the Hemingway daiquiri, which became known as the Papa Doble. And so a very famous incident where an American actually helped out with a very famous drink. All right. So, there it is. There's La Floridita there, the restaurant itself. Two Cubas. In fact, up until recently, there were two Cuban currencies. You had the convertible peso at the top, which had monuments on it, and that was a 1-to-1 exchange. And then you have the Cuban peso, which is a 24-to-1 exchange. The convertible peso was what was used basically by people who were interacting with the outside world. The peso itself was used by the common people in terms of buying things and doing their own kind of economic activity. However, that has changed recently. In fact, in summer of last year, the Cuban government eliminated the convertible peso and put everything on the regular peso, the 24-to-1 currency. And so that is the currency that now exists within Cuba. Now, something to keep in mind, your credit cards, your debit cards, and so on are probably going to be more of a hindrance in Cuba than anything else. There are very few ATM machines, very few places, if any, take credit cards. So you need to have cash, and you need to get cash before, and you can't get Cuban cash until you actually get on the island. The one thing I would urge is do not take American cash to Cuba, because what happens is when you are doing the conversion, the Cuban government charges a surcharge for American conversions, and so you don't get as much in the exchange as you would otherwise. We took euros and did quite well. Some of the other people on our ship were not informed ahead of time, and they were rather irritated. You can also take Canadian dollars and British pounds and get a fair rate of exchange. While you're there, make sure you do a little bit of shopping. Unfortunately, the big red X tells you that you can no longer bring rum and Cuban cigars back into the United States. Those are forbidden. For a period of time there, we were able to, and that was our stash of things that we did bring back in to the United States. But there are a number of marketplaces like the San Francisco market right here that is in Havana and other places as well, where you can find plenty of different individual things. This was a little piece of artwork that we brought back in that I love. I just love it. It's a paper mache representation of an old car and the Floridita restaurant. I looked for something that was kind of unique, thinking that probably it's not a manufactured, everybody has it kind of thing. This was the only stall that I saw that had this particular piece of work. There's also, make sure that you always follow the rules. Make sure that you know that you're not allowed to take pictures like these of the Cuban military or police. I kind of did take a couple of pictures that probably I should not have taken. I always made sure that the police were facing the other way when I took that picture. And in fact, actually, you see a lot of these kind of pictures of the police within Havana and other cities too, of them just standing around. And I was reminded on the ship itself with a gentleman who had visited East Germany during the time of the Soviet Union's rule over that. And he said friends in East Germany told him quite simply why they stood around so much. He said, because we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And it's sort of the situation that probably a number of these gentlemen and a number of these people are encountering. Make sure that you experience the culture when you're in Havana. It's not enough to just walk around and enjoy the sights and so on, but listen to the music and look at the art and be a part of the culture of the island. It's a very rich culture. The music is wonderful. In fact, actually, you can't listen to the music and stand still. None of these performers ever stand still in a kind of a choir arrangement when they're performing. So please make sure that you do that and meet the people too. There are so many wonderful folks that are really fascinated by who we are and what we're about, and would love to meet us. And I think you'll find a variety of people with all kinds of political viewpoints, and they're quite willing to express those political viewpoints throughout the island as well. All right. So finally, of course, everybody always says, well, what about the cars? Did you ride in a car? And here is our car. The lower left picture is the Ford Custom Line that I've been referring to. And so what I think I'm going to do, I think I'll end the presentation with and allow you to take a little ride with me. So enjoy the ride. It's a windy day, and we're on the Melancon, which is the seafront highway in Havana. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but our driver has a picture of Fidel Castro proudly displayed on the dashboard. And he was a very proud communist, and he said that my car is a government car, but he's also proud of the fact that it was an original car. He pointed out that a number of the old-looking cars are actually filled with European engines and drivetrains. But this one was authentic, that the pieces and parts were all authentic parts. That's the Nacional Hotel, which is a government-owned hotel, old hotel. All right. So thank you for joining us today and putting up with my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I think I will go ahead and unshare the screen, and we'll see what kind of questions we have. Looks like we have a few minutes left to talk about things. Okay, I see. Does the government allow citizens from other countries to visit as tourists? Yep. We are pretty much the only country that restricts tourism. There are several resorts on the north coast of Cuba that are to the east of Havana that we did not get a chance to go and visit. That European tourists, Canadians, British, from all kinds of different countries come to and visit and enjoy. So yeah, the embargo that we are doing is a solely U.S. kind of embargo. Hardly anybody else respects the embargo or abides by the embargo. Let's see. Somebody else also traveled to Cuba. Excellent. Okay, and Myrna, thank you for those comments. That's good to know that you have those abilities. Is American Airlines? I tried to find American Airlines and Southwest. I'm looking through the question and answer section right now. I tried to find flights from American Airlines and Southwest to Cuba and was not able to call any up. But it's encouraging that if they are starting to restore those, that's really good. Some of them were stopped during the COVID-19 epidemic as well because the airport was closed down. Somebody asked, an anonymous attendee asks, did I feel that I was being followed while we were visiting the island? There was definitely a sense that we were being shown what they wanted us to see, especially in Santiago and Cienfuegos. The tour guides most likely were members of the Cuban military or some kind of government officials. And so there was a sense that we were having that. It wasn't really harsh. In other words, nobody was corralling us and saying, wait, you have to come back over here. Don't look over there. And once we got to Havana, especially, we were able to be on our own quite a bit. We left our tour on the second day we were in Havana and thanked our guide and then wandered off into the city on our own and really had a good time. So yes, there is that sense of if you're on a tour, you're being guided, but I don't think I was being followed so much. Let's see, somebody says I had a trip booked with the tour operator Cuba Explorer for July of 20, but they had to cancel it. Yes. Hopefully they will be starting back up, and she says they are starting it back up. That's great. Have I seen the recent film Yuli? Yes. Yeah, that is a wonderful movie. My wife and I watched it just a couple of weeks ago, and it's, I would highly recommend it as well. It also does a good job of getting it right as far as capturing the sense of the Cuban culture. Was there any mention of the Philippine American or the Philippine War of Independence? Not really. That wasn't necessarily part of what we were talking about or viewing or seeing. So it was definitely Cuban centered. Maybe problems by traveling through third countries. What are the issues? Well, it all depends on whether you meet the requirements that the State Department has set down for travel to Cuba. And so you've got to make sure that you're going through for one of the categories that's there, and you have to be able to obtain the visa and do those things. So if the third country travel is an attempt to circumvent any of those requirements, then that can possibly cause you a problem. I do know of people who have done that and have not suffered any consequences, but it's a bit of a risk. So in the chat section, I see some questions as well. I wonder if foreign embassies in Washington, D.C. own the land their buildings are located on. I looked that up when I found out about the park in Tampa, Florida. They own the building, but the land underneath is still United States territory. Let's see. Myrna also mentions that she had the feeling that they were being watched, but they also wanted to keep us safe as well. Are student visas accepted as a reason to travel? If it fits the education category, yes. I know a number of universities have taken student groups to Cuba and are able to make that happen. Is it safe to travel to Cuba as an American? That's a great question. We had a friend on board the ship, and she went off on her own, went to the Tropicana, which is the huge Cuban nightclub. And the nightclub shut down about 2 a.m. It's about 10 blocks from the ship. She walked back from the ship by herself through the streets and never had any problem at all. She was completely comfortable the entire time. In fact, she actually came upon a group of men who just simply greeted her and said hello, and they conversed for a while, and then she went on her way. Yeah, I think one of the things is crime is fairly harshly punished, and so there's not a whole lot of danger on the streets, or at least there wasn't in 2016. With the problems that they're having economically right now, it might have changed, but that's where we were. then. Let's see. See if there are any other questions that people have. That's pretty much it. Well, I'm going to change hats here and wear my Cuban national baseball team hat that we also picked up. And there are a number of Cuban baseball players who have come over. It's a little bit easier for them to get to play for the professional leagues now here, but yeah, that's been a sore point between the countries as well. That a number of people defecting, especially the more talented individuals in sports or science or education or whatever it might be as well, the arts as well. Okay. Michelle, thank you very much for that comment about the price of the flights to fly to Havana. Yes, it's expensive. It can be very expensive. Evan, I think that is it. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Ben. This is a wonderful tour that you gave us through your visit, and it's certainly fascinating. Cuba is certainly a place that I like to visit, particularly as a fan of Afro-Cuban music in particular. I would love to be able to experience that firsthand.
Yeah.
So hopefully one day I'll be able to make that trip. But thanks again for the effort that it took for you to put that PowerPoint together, your thoughtful, engaging dialogue. It was a pleasure. So thank you, Ben.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Well, if you would like to engage with us further at the IRC, we do invite you to visit our website at www.irckc.org to learn about other IRC programs and how to join us as a member. We also invite you to learn more about the work of the English Speaking Union at www.esuus.com/Kansas City. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much to Ben again for taking the time. Looks like Myrna put in another comment about her bringing the Rotary Club, so to speak with her in person. But nonetheless, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening. We hope to see you soon.